Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. One of my followers on YouTube has requested a video about Brigadier General Reginald Edward Harry Dyer. He's known to many as the Butcher of Amritsar. So, who is this most detestable Dyer? Well, he was an officer in the Indian Army who was born in India, but in what we now call Pakistan. So his family had worked there for a couple of generations. I'm not quite sure his family's origins, were they Irish or were they English? But anyway, after growing up in India for some years, as a teenager, he went to school in Ireland, to Middleton College, which still exists. Now, if he wasn't at least partly Irish, it'd be highly unusual for him to go to Ireland rather than Great Britain. And so his father was an army officer before him. And after that, Dyer, he went to England. He studied at a military academy from the age of 18, took 2 years. He was commissioned. That was it, to be an army officer. But he served in the Indian Army rather than the British Army. I'm not quite sure why he didn't go to India for that military training, because I think the Indian Army trained its officers separately, actually, in India. But having grown up in India, he was conversant in at least one of the local languages, in Urdu certainly, but I mean that's obviously mutually comprehensible with Hindi. So he went out to India. So the British Army, well, the officers were drawn from the upper classes, occasionally the upper middle classes as well. And they're sometimes self-perpetuating, could be several generations of them doing it. Likewise in the Indian Army. Remember, through most of the 19th century, the officers in the Indian Army were almost exclusively British. And nowadays, obviously, there are plenty of British Indians. But back then, being British meant being white. People were British subjects, but they weren't British as such in India. So in the early 20th century, some Indians began to be commissioned in the Indian Army, rose up through the ranks. And by 1947, the majority of officers in the Indian Army were Indian. Anyhow, so he served in India in a number of campaigns. But what really interests us is what happened just after the First World War. So on 11th of November 1918, the armistice was signed. So the British Empire and Germany and all the other belligerents, they'd suspended hostilities whilst the long-term peace was being decided. They were going to negotiate in Paris. However, it wasn't certain that negotiations would come to fruition. There was a real possibility the negotiations could break down and the hostilities could recommence. Therefore, technically, the war was still on. A lot of the emergency legislation remained in effect. So, because of the First World War, DORA had been passed, Defence of the Realm Act, giving the government sweeping powers to censor the press and so on, to suspend habeas corpus, that's to detain people without trial and so forth, because it was exigent that enemy spies and fifth columnists not be allowed to get around and things like that, a bit like state of emergency in India today or president's rule and things like that. Anyway, so this was coming up to April 1919. The Congress Party, which is the main Indian Nationalist Party, wanted dominion status within the British Empire. They wanted a similar situation such as pertained in Australia or Canada. They'd still be part of the British Empire, relying on London for defence and foreign affairs, but India would be internally self-ruling. That was the idea. Congress Party, they saw some benefits to being in the British Empire, but they felt there needed to be political evolution. Couldn't continue as it was. Now, the British government was in a fairly invidious position in the First World War. This was a hairy moment for the United Kingdom, and they needed the fulsome cooperation of the Congress Party. So they said, well, we'll absolutely look at it, but we're non-committal. They didn't want to promise something because they didn't want to deliver extensive reform. Anyway, so there were a lot of protests after the First World War that this extraordinary security legislation was being continued. And even though people in India felt the war is over, well, it wasn't quite over. It wasn't until the 28th of June 1919 that the Treaty of Versailles was signed, or the other belligerent European countries, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria. It was even later than that. Anyhow, though lots of protests had broken out across India, the country was in a state of unrest. And the Congress Party, having been fairly cooperative with the British Raj up at this time, became non-cooperators. Their attitude was adversarial. And they were oppositional because they thought that asking courteously and attempting to parley with the British authorities had not borne fruit. So they had to pressurize the Viceroy, Viscount Chelmsford, and so on, pressurize Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister. So a lot of these protests were banned, but they went ahead anyway, and it was more than the government could handle. So Amritsar in particular was a hotbed of agitation. Everybody knows that Amritsar, the tank of nectar, is the holy city of the Sikhs. Now it's got a high Sikh majority these days, not so much in 1919. Remember, this is before partition. So there was a considerable Muslim minority there, and obviously there were more Hindus there than there are today. And some public buildings were burnt down, and 5 Europeans were slain. Whites in India, they used to call them Europeans in those days. Well, they almost all were of European origins. So all protests were banned, and some elderly white women had been beaten up. So Dyer really strongly overreacted to this and said the lane where this woman was assaulted, any Indian here must crawl through it, and Indians have to salam, as in like salute, express deference towards whites. So it was a very unpalatable expression of racial supremacy. But Dyer went out with about 60 soldiers, some of whom didn't have rifles. I'm not sure why he was marching outside his barracks when there was a situation of wild disorder in the city. But he then saw the crowd as much bigger than he anticipated. It was several thousand strong. He thought he can easily be surrounded and overwhelmed. His troops were all Indians and Gurkhas. They weren't British. Now, there were some young men in the crowd. Well, the crowd was mostly young men, actually. Some had lathis and a few had petrol and so on. So I suppose they should have beat a hasty retreat. But he thought, oh my God, they can charge us, just beat us to death with their hands. Unarmed people can and do charge armed people. They can come a bit closer and a bit closer. And what when they're just only like a metre away, they could just grab our rifles off us. At what point do you fire? If they're not actually attacking you, the crowd, if they're not throwing something, or they're not charging with a stick, at what point is acceptable open fire? Well, he decided very early. But anyway, it was possible to resolve this without killing anyone. He didn't even try to. So he said, we're going to have to shoot. No warning. You could shoot in the air, try and scatter the cloud. No. He said they had their warning. They were told, no, there must be no protests. Do you want peace or war? He had that pasted up on the posters put around town. So his idea was, if you only shoot a few people, that won't cow the crowd. That will simply enrage them. And they will come for us, baying for our blood. We'll be torn apart. So he orders men to fire and reload and keep firing. And they fired for, it was up to 10 minutes. And they shot thousands of people. Now, the official death toll, if I got this right, it's 476. Some people speculate that the death toll is several times higher than that. And so some of the people shot dead were women and children. Many of the men who were shot dead were unarmed. And obviously he blocked the only exit to Jallianwala Bagh, that public garden. So that was that. He was completely unrepentant. So for every person that was killed, probably 2 more were wounded. Many of the wounded would have been saved, but obviously the hospitals were just overwhelmed by gunshot victims. So it was a horrific thing to do. Now, it did calm the situation. I suppose we were just so petrified that there was this madman on the loose who was going to shoot people on the slightest pretext. Shockingly, some of the British community in India lauded him as though he'd done something magnificent, calling him the hero of the hour, the saviour of the Punjab, presenting him with a sword, opening him a fund, sort of a generous pension when he retired, because the British authorities said, oh my God, you've got to go, you've got to retire now, which is very lenient. Now, most people would say he should be charged with murder. Obviously, soldiers, they're issued with rifles, they are allowed to shoot people dead under certain circumstances, not willy-nilly, not when someone's not presenting a threat, not use more force than you need to. So there wasn't a sufficient legal and moral justification to do this, and he said he was teaching them a lesson and things like that. The man was a malevolent madman, seems to me. Perhaps calling him a lunatic is actually just letting him off the hook. I don't know of any proper psychiatric evaluation saying he was mentally ill. And Congress was obviously aghast and outraged at this. Fascinatingly, if you read Nehru's autobiography, he said he was on a train sometime later, and he just happened to be sharing a carriage with Dyer. So yes, Indians and Britishers could share train carriages. and he overheard Dyer saying he thought of killing even more people. However, he was moved by compassion, and he decided to spare the city. That was that. Now, Sir Michael O'Dwyer was the governor of the Punjab at the time, another Irishman, who didn't order this action to be taken, but once it was done, he was a stalwart defender of what Dyer had done. Dyer ought to be named killer. So Dyer returned to England, where he died some years later from falling down the stairs. You can find out where he's interred on Find a Grave, but I'm worried people will go and desecrate his grave. So what he did was most certainly evil, and probably did more to dissolve the Raj than anything else. So he is widely detested in India. Staggeringly, some Sikh clergy held a ceremony to invest him as an honorary Sikh in the Golden Temple, Hari Mandir, just after that. I couldn't quite believe that when I read it. Presumably most of the people he killed had been Sikh, but there you are. So that is the rightly reviled Dyer of unhappy and inglorious memory.